So let's jump right in. We're going over to here, and you guys can see my mouse. Treat this like a laser pointer. Going on this consulting angle, I'd say a lot of what AgileLens does is we sit down with architecture firms, real estate companies, now also quite a few folks involved with live events, virtual conferences. Just got finished working with the real-time conference, which was excellent. Check out some of those on-demand webinars sometime. But what we often sit down to discuss is, what kind of use case do you think VR would be best suited for your company? And we kind of think of it as this low risk, stable reward kind of method of thinking about it, and a high risk, higher reward where you can be more cutting edge, really be pushing the envelope with what these tools can do. But, Steam VR is going to crash and you're going to have some issues. So it's what the tolerance level is for that. But the things I'd like to talk about today are kind of just 5 general categories for how XR, that is to say VR and AR, can be really useful in AEC. And in fact, all the presentations you've already seen so far today, I'd say also fit into these categories. So we'll be talking about how do you communicate as an architect or designer your design intent, the ways that this technology allows for pure creative expression. I think Archeo is just a great example of that, just being able to rapidly iterate through ideas, designing from the inside out, actually being inside of a space and then changing how the space feels and then having that be reflected in the construction documents, taking old problems that were traditionally solved in certain ways and now solving those problems in new ways. And then lastly, bringing people together. So yes, we've talked a little bit about multi-user experiences today, so I'll just briefly touch on how much of a force multiplier it is to have a lot of people in the same experience. So starting with communicating design intent. So this takes me back to when I first got started with VR in 2013 with the Oculus Rift DK1. I was working at a company called Fisher Dax Associates Theater Planning and Design that designs theaters all over the world. And a big part of that job involved making pretty simple, not even renders, just kind of screenshot exports from 3ds Max that were just meant to be very simple spatial communicators of different design options. So here you basically see the same view being communicated 4 different ways depending on how the seat is laid out. And I often found that when you sat down in a meeting to say like, okay, here's our 4 options, a lot of the discussion would be limited by this being an inherently 2D representation of 3D space. You'd have people saying like, oh man, the head in front of me looks way too close, or God, that stage looks really far away. When as soon as we were able to start using virtual reality, and again, this is very early days, 2013, 2014, representing that same information, but with someone inside a VR headset, you immediately get past this skepticism or misunderstanding of what the rendering is trying to convey. And instead, you're in the space. And if you're cycling between these options, you feel the differences between those options. So the very first project we got to do this for was the Center for Chinese Opera in West Kowloon, China, with Bing Tom Architects. And the response was quite wonderful, both from the architect and the client, because everyone just felt more like they were on the same page. So that really opened our eyes pretty early on to how this could be useful for us as designers, and then also getting really good feedback from clients and other collaborators when we could all look at VR together. And very briefly, I'd just like to say that led pretty quickly into also thinking about the use cases of the architecture we're designing. So of course, in this case, designing theaters, you actually have performances in them. So Kenneth Branagh had a production Macbeth at the Park Avenue Armory, New York City, which I'm sure almost none of you may know. It is a huge space that's the size of a New York City block. A lot of really crazy custom experiences happen in there. And there was a very compressed timeline to figure out how to get everything working. So really simple representations of the seating, the set design, the lighting, the actor blocking, just did worlds of helpfulness to help everyone feel like, okay, this is what it's actually going to look like. Great. So shorter timeline than architecture, but still relevant. And again, uses a lot of the same techniques. And that led pretty quickly into, what I would just call immersive visualization. So a lot of real estate work where it's like, hey, we're just trying to go from certain renders that are evoking a certain feeling, certain image of a space, and now it just let's make sure that people can actually interact with the space, navigate through it. This is being used a lot for pre-sales now in real estate, so that way they can set up something like this in a leasing office, and before the building is even constructed, you start to get people to sign leases, and they feel more comfortable with that versus a rendering, because they actually can have a sense of like, oh, it's a pretty big space or whatever, and see the views. And we always have things like you can play bocce ball and cornhole and things like that in these as well. So those are pretty straightforward. A cool project we got to do this for pretty early on was the Statue of Liberty Museum on Liberty Island with FX Collaborative. And we got to play with, changing the time of day, and even going into the gift shop and playing with a Statue of Liberty model. Also, very easy to do a site model when you're building a custom experience in like Unity or Unreal Engine, because you can literally just take all of your assets and shrink it down to a smaller size. So that was pretty cool. And also because the building just recently opened, it was our first opportunity to get to compare a VR experience to the actual experience of being there. And so the Historic Society of Liberty Island, that's totally not their title, but the folks that we also showed this experience to, they were very happy being able to show this before the project opened to give people a nice preview of what the space was actually going to be like. So, communicating design intent can also be just good marketing once the design intent is finalized and things are under construction. So category 2, enhanced creative expression. So yes, the first thing I like to put forward here is that VR or AR does not need to be photorealistic to be immersive. All it needs to be is consistent. And the first excellent example I thought of with this was really the fact that we use the word immersion, which to me evokes something like being underwater. And I think that's a nice starting point to think about immersion, because when you're underwater, things don't look the same, things don't sound the same, things don't feel the same. If you could smell underwater, things would not smell the same. So it's a different experience for all of your senses, but we don't say it's unrealistic. It's just different within this other medium, I guess you could say. So with that in mind, an early VR experience that I really love showing people as a reference for this is by a friend of mine named Matt Colley, who runs a studio called Borrowed Light Studio. And this is a piece he did called The Night Cafe, where you are inside of a Vincent van Gogh painting. And it doesn't look photorealistic, but it sure does look and feel like you are inside a Van Gogh painting. There's no straight edges. There's no right angles. Everything feels like these long, languid brush strokes. And even the way the lighting works, the lamps and the starry night sky there, all feels consistent to this one world. And architects can do this too. You can design a space that is more gestural and sketchy and starts to feel like it's evoking the potential of something rather than saying, here's the photorealistic finished version. Something we got to play with this a little bit on the AR side was there's a historic in America, being like 1800s, a historic house a couple hours north of New York City, where there was an exhibit last summer called Architecture and Conversation with Nature. And we got to work with these artists and the Magic Leap headset and iPads to allow for this AR experience where you had these paintings and nature coming into the actual environment. So the iPads had this kind of stanchion setup where you could just kind of look through the webcam and see these different, things happening in the space. But the Magic Leap version actually allowed you to very freely move throughout the space and experience this really wonderful creative artwork in a new kind of way, spatially too. And then, touching briefly on some of the more theatrical narrative stuff my company's been involved with, this was an experience that we knew was going to premiere at a specific architectural site, you could say, a brewery, an actual location. If anyone knows what immersive theater is, we knew that was going to be happening with this ghost speed dating experience where you swipe left for the ghosts you don't like and you swipe right for the ghosts you do, pick your favorite at the end. And we were able to prototype this experience, which was going to be for AR in VR. And this is something I encourage anyone to do that's going to be dealing with something site specific, like a building going up on a construction site. And it sounds, again, like the other speakers today are also thinking about this stuff as well. And so you can use VR to prototype AR. So here you're seeing a very simple SketchUp model of the actual space that we knew the AR experience would be happening in. And then we could actually test it in VR, which was a great way to think about every aspect of how the AR experience would work for people on site. Number 3, designing from the inside out. So everyone knows about the legend of the napkin sketch, I guess you could say. It's this wonderful little thing that people are supposed to be able to do that then represents the potential of what a building could become. And I say that everyone should be treating VR programs like Tilt Brush and Gravity Sketch and, again, some of the sketching tools we saw today as their new sketchbooks, because these are opportunities to convey the same imaginative qualities of what a space could become that you get from a napkin sketch or something in a sketchbook, but now it's spatial. And so you can then be inside of a space and actually really feel how it is to come into the foyer, or a compression and release idea of moving down a hallway and then coming into a larger space without dealing with, everything that comes along with the baggage of what exactly is that material, what's the wall thickness, and everything that comes on later with the project. So here you're seeing actually a tilt brush sketch brought into Unreal Engine and then used kind of as an underlay, trace paper, as was mentioned earlier, and then using that as a way to then mass out all sorts of ideas with, just massing models, real furniture, lighting, and then eventually you can bring all of that back into Revit. This isn't anything proprietary. Like, you can just do this by using Tilt Brush, a $20 program, bringing it into Unreal Engine, which is free, and then exporting everything as an FBX, then converting the FBX to a DWG to bring it all back into Revit. So it's not like the easiest thing in the world, but it's certainly doable if you already have access to some of these programs. And so you're seeing there that basically, when I'm designing in VR, I treat it very gesturally. I'm not trying to be precise in there, but then you can bring all of that into a more precise tool like Revit, and then make, the final construction ready version. So we saw a similar image to this earlier, VR trace paper. That's very useful. And then we've also done similar things with set design. So to keep going back to these theater examples, so you can sketch out something like a set design or anything that might be a changeable part of a piece of architecture once it's done. I also think about museums and exhibits, and you can test this stuff out in the space very quickly. Maybe not even you, but maybe even the potential users of a space. So we've done these kinds of studies with set designers while designing actual theaters. And then I've also had a lot of fun taking advantage of this particular feature of Tilt Brush, where it remembers every stroke in the order that you make it, so you can play back a sketch you've made for anyone inside a VR headset, and then they get to see kind of your whole design process play out really quickly. And this was an idea that came to me when I was thinking about what it would be like to design a space that could exist entirely within virtual reality, didn't have to worry about the built version, real budgets, real anything like that. So this started out as a sketch, and then I got to basically mass out the whole thing inside Unreal Engine, use the VR editor in there, and then have some fun creating that space. And so that's become more of a part of regular design workflow as well. This whole thing is being recorded, but you feel free to grab a screenshot of this if you want. These are just some of the tools out there. They're not very expensive, that allow for being very creative if you want to play with sketching, modeling, doing all sorts of things in VR. Number 4, new solutions to old problems. So these will be kind of some rapid fire case studies where we'll say, here's the thing that always needs to be solved with architecture projects. Here's a way VR, AR can solve that. So pretty simple thing, moving through spaces at scale. So yeah, it's very difficult to convey the actual sensation of moving from one space to another. Renders are snapshots of moments in an experience, and animation always has kind of a horror movie effect to it when you have like a dolly, kind of flying into a space. It doesn't really convey what it's like to walk. And so VR can be a really wonderful way to actually feel what that's like. So this isn't by me. This is a very talented VR artist named Matt Schaefer. And this is a great little sketch he did of a gallery space. And you'll notice that there's a few things going on here. There's sketching, there's massing, and there's also some thought going into the circulation and how people might move through the space. So you can imagine in a scenario like this, you could actually have the whole thing at scale and let people walk through the space on their own, do some user testing, and then compare that to how you want them to move through the space. And, you could very rapidly iterate and make design adjustments until you're getting something closer to where these arrows are, for example. And then brown boxing. Who's ever done brown boxing? This is an incredibly time-consuming thing that I used to have to do when I worked at more traditional architecture firms, where you're trying to help clients, collaborators, etc., understand what it's actually like to be inside of a space. And so VR can be great for that, even in a very quick sketch format. Or this is by my friends over at Bevel Space. You can do these very quick mock-ups that maybe have a little more realism to them, but you're not worried about massing them or creating the entire building. In this case, you'll see this is a kind of a hospital space, and you can get this kind of ergonomic sense of moving through the space and grabbing different elements. And you can have a situation where, for example, maybe you have a doctor who's actually going to be working at a hospital that you are helping to design. And you can say, how would you like your OR to be laid out? And let them come into a little virtual reality mock-up like this. And they can say, well, yeah, I always want my sink to be within a 90-degree turning radius of where I'm standing here. And you can start to get some really valuable ultimate end user input in this kind of fashion. Problem, specifying equipment in a very complex space. So we had the pleasure of working on the shed in Hudson Yards. Really crazy custom space. No one, even trained architects and designers, could really look at the orthographic drawings of this, the plans and the sections, and really understand what was going on in the space. So we created a very simple VR mockup. This took like a day, grabbed a section box, brought this into Unity, and we said, this doesn't need to look good. We're never going to show this to the public. We'll never show this to the public. But we just need to understand what it's like to move through the space. And then here's the other thing. We have equipment that needs to be specified that is either going to need 4 feet of clearance or 7 feet of clearance. So you'll see all I did here was I took a 4-foot stick and a 7-foot stick, and that just kind of follows you around as you move through the space, as you also have that little scale representation person. And then we could actually just mark very quickly, on a little key plan, yes, we want equipment here. No, it won't fit there. Yes, it will fit there. So just really helps with spatial understanding. And then you see very briefly there's text popping up. So, a lot of the geometry in here is placeholders. So that's literally just querying what the name of the Revit object is and just telling you what the name is. So very quick mockups. Human scale UX for video mapping. If you ever work on a project with anything 2D, images or video mapping, you might think, well, VR is not going to be useful for that. It's 2D. But of course, the 2D is experienced within something more spatial. So for example, we worked with Bravo Media on the late show Stephen Colbert's renovation of the Ed Sullivan Theater, where there's a very short timeline to create this Church of Stephen Colbert effect. So creating a very simple VR mock-up that allowed you to basically steer the projectors around the grid and aim them allowed for a very fast process of just figuring out which projections would work best, what throw distance to give them, what focal length, and where to put them and how many, in a way where the traditional method for doing that would have taken much, much longer. Similarly, this was a very quick mock-up done for SOM of an atrium space where they just wanted to get a sense of what's it like to have some people moving around. And then they wanted to see some different options for this video mapping on the walls here. So these are just, MP4s mapped onto the geometry. And we could play with things like different color, different text, different gradients, different speeds. And it's so different just looking at the little tiny video of these things versus actually saying oh yeah, this is going to be a 50-foot wall. And here's what it actually looks like in that space. So you can really get into the nuance of the design, even little things how big should those arrows be? What color should it be? How quickly should they fade? These elements that can be very hard to not only understand yourself as a designer, but then again, communicate to collaborators and clients. Now, here's the thing. We all, at some point, need to not just show people VR things, but also export 2D media. And so one of the ways that VR is great for that is if you already have a fully textured, rendered, whatever stage the design is at project, then it's very simple, actually, to then output renders, animations, and more traditional 2D media to communicate the design at a variety of accessibility levels. So for example, this project for Yale, we actually were in VR laying out where we'd have the camera go for certain animations. You could call this very simple virtual production. And that was incredibly useful to do that in VR. And this is all essentially rendering in real time because it's all baked into Unreal Engine. Very easy. And then here's a project for Seattle Rep, where we needed to look at some different design options for a little wall on the side. And you're also seeing some photos there just to show you the difference between the Unreal Engine version and the real version. And obviously the ideal way to look at the design options is actually this upper right image. Where is it? There, that one. Because that actually allowed you to see these three options and what it's like to lean near them or get further away. But a lot of people actually needed to have input in this process. Not all of them could see the VR experience. So we also were able to create, 360 videos of this that you could view on YouTube. That's what you're actually seeing down here is the 360 wraparound, where in YouTube you could just look around with the mouse or with a Google Cardboard. And then we also had like web VR experiences that could all just be accessed from a browser. So this is all very easy to create once you've gone far enough to create the fully navigable VR experience. And then here's the thing. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but some architects sometimes would come to us and say, I'm very frustrated by this project. And at one point we had an architect that we liked working with a lot. And he said, just as a little treat, we'll do this for them. We'll actually be able to turn on physics for their project so that if they want to, they can do something like this, where they can just light things on fire and break stuff and knock stuff around. Kind of a rage room cathartic release of, I'm just mad at everyone right now and just need to get this out of my system. And so this started out kind of just as a joke, just something to do for fun. But sometimes this stuff actually turns out to be pretty useful because Unreal Engine fairly recently has gotten an incredibly realistic destruction simulation system called Chaos in it. And so now, based on some of our silly experiments and adapting these to be more actually realistic, we're able to actually start working on really meaningful projects like life safety, fire safety, evacuation kinds of projects where it's like, yeah, we actually need to be able to figure out how are people going to get out of this space if there's an emergency, if something's on fire. And you can even have things like, firefighters actually training inside spaces that are actually responding the way to a real physical environment. So sometimes even things that are just fun and playful can actually become meaningful. And then here we go. Here's the kind of the last big push here. This was a project that is currently under construction that we were lucky enough to spend the entire design process in VR with. So starting in 2015, you'll notice there's no materials, textures, anything like that here. We started out just with simple massing models, and this was just about spatial ideas. There's a blue scheme here and a green scheme, and we just wanted to be able to compare and contrast the two in a really simple way, put a few different elements on stage. Here's the blue scheme, here's the green scheme, and we're like, okay, step one, concept design, we like the green scheme better. Then we also wanted to be able to actively adjust the design from within the space, not just with sketching, but actually grabbing physical objects. So this is a little video from a company called The Void that has these wonderful VR arcades all over the world. But you can do this with a really simple mock-up using what's called a Vive tracker that you can attach to basically any object you have a 3D model of. So here, little Vive tracker attached to an Eames chair, and then that Eames chair becomes tracked inside virtual space. So what we could do is things where we like grab a real physical chair, and then that automatically will snap to the closest chair to you in VR. And then as you move the real chair around to adjust for, comfort, sight lines, etc., that changes in the VR model and then can be piped back into Revit and actually affect the design. A few other things you're seeing here, playing with different options for the aisles, different things on stage, different options for seating, and actually experiencing how it feels to change between these options. You'll see up in the light grid, looking down to see like where can the lights go for the space in the catwalk. And then also, because this whole project stayed in VR, we can also kind of keep this memory of the project over time, going back and forth to the old SketchUp model, looking at the Revit version, and watching how the design progresses. Here's a cool little moment where we had a very old architect in here actually adjusting the railing design here to make it as comfortable as possible. So we had this set up so there were like code constraints and you couldn't put it in a way that wouldn't actually be allowed to be built. But it allowed for just saying like, okay, this railing feels right. You get to use an architect with a lot of design instinct to just say like, yeah, this is where the railing should be. And they don't need to sketch it. They can physically place it in a spatial context. And then again, that can make its way back over to the real construction documents. So here you see very quickly the SketchUp model, and then about midway through design development in the Revit model. And then later on where we started to think about colors more, but we weren't quite happy with where we were ending up with the colors and the lighting in Unity. So we actually ended up bringing this whole project over to Unreal Engine to really focus more on colors, lighting, photorealism. And what's wonderful is the VR editor, the out-of-the-box click VR editor inside Unreal Engine, allows for doing exactly what you're seeing here, where you can do something like just say, I'm just going to play with this color right now. And you can be standing in the space and just have a big old gradient ball there and saying like, okay, yeah, here's how it feels with warmer colors or cooler colors. And so what eventually happened here was, we've started to narrow down a few different color options for the seats, the walls, and then could just toggle through them in VR and figure out which ones felt the best, which was really cool. Like I'd never been able to do that before and feel like we were coming up with the best option, because usually iteration time can't be that fast. And then going back to what I mentioned about Yale and the Seattle Rep project, anytime we wanted to just export these to people who aren't going to be able to look at it in VR, very simple to just do it from the Unreal Engine model. So here's where those colors were in 2018, and then here's where they ended up in 2019. And then, we also got to do things like start to populate the space and actually see, okay, let's now actually get a sense of what it's like to be in the space and move around it and jump around to different seats. Again, thinking about users of the actual space, eventually we could start to play with things like different set design and performances. There's some motion capture here, some volumetric capture. You could play with changing the capacity of the house. We actually had fun putting actors on stage and letting them see how it felt to perform to audiences of different sizes. And then here's a little quick drone cam of what it was like moving through the actual construction of the project. And here's something cool. Change orders are often a huge extra burden in the budgets of large architecture projects. I think the average is somewhere between 10 and 15% of a construction budget goes to change orders. This project is looking, I don't want to quote a number that's going to be wrong, but let's say significantly lower percentage of the budget going to change orders. And I think we can attribute a lot of that to how much of the project has been spent in VR. So there aren't as many surprises, and that's pretty great. So very quickly, this was just kind of a fun thing where I grabbed a couple images off the Instagram of, this is the Brockman Hall for Opera now, and I just literally dropped these Instagram images on top of our rendering. So it's kind of cool to see how close the final construction as we get there is to what we were able to render out of VR. And then I just have to show this image. These are actual moments we've had in our projects in the past where it just goes to show how important it is to communicate design clearly. You have these issues where things are not interpreted as they should be. And this is always what I imagine is happening when that happens. So the more people you can get to experience it in VR, especially once you get to the construction side, the fewer weird mistakes you're going to have. Last step, bringing people together. Multi-user is great. This is not quite the out-of-the-box multi-user template out of Unreal Engine, but this was the Kennedy Center where we were looking at all these different options for the ceiling. Again, here's an example where there's not a lot of lighting or texturing or anything like that going on. It was about evaluating these different ceiling options. So this is a very simple way to get multiple people into an experience, and they can be in 2D, VR, some people in 2D, some people in VR, and everyone gets like a nice little laser pointer and you can talk to each other and, in this case, the major modification I made was the ability to have a host that guides you around the entire experience. So everyone can look wherever they want, but there's one person who says, hey, we're going over here now, and here's what we're looking at, and cycling through design options. So that's a very simple out-of-the-box tool that if you have any familiarity with the Unreal Engine, check it out. If you don't, feel free to drop me a message, and I'm happy to help get you started there. And I also had the wonderful benefit of designing a piece of architecture for the Venice Film Festival last year that was going to be experienced entirely within virtual reality. But the same way that I'd be designing a real piece of architecture, I was able to use these tools like the Unreal Engine VR editor to mock up, again, what it would actually feel like to be standing in that space, because your body doesn't really care whether you're in a virtual space or a real space. It's still going to react to a lot of these elements in the same sort of way. So to wrap up, we've talked about communicating design intent to just help people understand, here's the design, try to understand it. Being more creative when you're working through a design on your own. We talked about actually designing from the inside out. I didn't show a few other examples of things where we would do things like grab a ceiling or a wall from within VR and literally just push it until it's just so, like just exactly where it wants to be. We talked about finding all sorts of different ways that VR and AR and XR can help to solve old problems in new ways. And then multi-user, just a couple brief examples of what it's like to get a lot of people into the same experience and be able to have really meaningful discussions about the design when you can have, say, for example, a guide in there to help everyone look at the right things, and then also just feel like you're not alone in VR. Then it's not too isolating. And then if you enjoyed this very quick flyby talk, I'd also recommend there's kind of a sequel to this talk that you can check out on my YouTube channel at iBrews, where then I go deeper into like, okay, but if you're going to build a VR experience or AR, how do you make it really meaningful, and how do you target it to your audience and make it really do what you want to? So feel free to check that out. And really, I would just say my whole goal as an XR evangelist is I'm trying to move beyond where I see a lot of VR right now, where you're kind of going back and forth a lot between a computer, 2D modeling and looking at something in VR, more of a design review workflow, and then eventually getting a building out of it. And I'm trying to move more towards just, you can look at things and make meaningful design decisions in VR and have that actually be what ends up being the final result. That's where we're headed. Thank you very much. I know I spoke very fast and we're a little bit over time, but maybe time for one question or something.
Thanks, Alex. I think, I knew this was going to happen. I knew by the end of the session I was going to be like, oh gosh, so many questions, so many things, which is a good thing because there's, very few times you get exposed to so many ways of using VR. And it's actually amazing to see all the work that you've done and how it actually impacts the people that use it. I think I do want to ask you something before we get started with the overall forum. And before I do, I apologize for everyone. We are running a bit over time, but I think, it's you don't always get to be on one-on-one virtually with presenters such as them, which are extremely experienced on the area. So I do encourage you all to stay to ask your questions because, it's worth taking advantage of the fact that they're here. So Alex, a question for you. Out of all the things that you've done, what has been the most surprising or the craziest experience that you've had with a client using VR?
Well, going back to talking earlier about the way that people respond sometimes unexpectedly to VR or AR, I'll bring up two quick examples. One was the Statue of Liberty Museum project with FX Collaborative, where I was so excited to show them that Unreal Engine project, and they put on the VR headset, and I was ready for them to take it off and say, "This is amazing, thank you so much." And instead, the architect took off the headset and just kind of sighed, and he was like, and I was like, "Oh, whoa, what's wrong?" And he's like, "I really wish we had looked at this a lot earlier," because for the first time, he was seeing parts of the project where he's like, "Oh, is that really how that wall detail looks? Is that really how that joint condition happens?" Because then he wanted to make changes. And so that was when I really started to realize how important it is to start using these tools early on in the design process. So you don't get to that point where it might actually be too late to make design decisions. And then very briefly too, we had a group of young architects who were very excited about the potential of VR. And one of them put on a headset and immediately said, "Oh my God, wow, can I run forward?" And she didn't wait for us to say, "No, don't do that," and slammed right into our window. And we're 6 stories up, and thank goodness the window did not break. But yeah, it's crazy sometimes seeing how quickly people respond to this is reality. This is the new, everything that I see is real. So yeah, you get people trying to lean on tables or sit in chairs that aren't there. And by the way, it makes a huge difference if you can place a physical chair, even if you're not using the Vive tracker, if you can place a physical chair in the real world that corresponds to a virtual reality chair, just so people have that clear reference point of sitting down and standing up, that really, I find, helps people. Just a pro tip there.
Gosh, yeah, be very careful of the physical environment when you're using VR. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I think now I want to open for general questions for the whole audience, and there's quite a few coming in.